Dr. Gill see it before I gave it, but he foolishly said no. So this is going to be a little bit different, and what I'd like to do is, first off, violate 3 rules of business presentations. And the first rule is I'm going to apologize to you because I am violating 3 rules of business presentations. So that's the first rule I violated, is apologizing. The second rule that I'm going to violate is these are very, very busy slides. But they're going to be available to you, so you can peruse them at your leisure as you go through. And I'll just leave it at that, and I'll surprise you with what the third rule is. Now, what I'm going to talk about is this idea of an engaged scholar, but I've translated it to the enraged scholar, and you'll figure that out as I go through the presentation. Let's see if I can get this going right. All right. So let's start a little bit. It always helps to have a context about the person who's talking. So here's a little bit of context about me. As the introduction said, I've got a kind of varied background. I've been a senior executive at large companies. I've started a number of enterprises. I have an interesting position relative to Dr. Gill. I am actually a trustee at the University of South Florida. So I am his boss's 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 boss, but it doesn't interfere with our relationship whatsoever. But I am pretty sure I'm going to graduate on time. The other thing is that you will pick up as I go through this presentation is I often describe myself as an optimistic curmudgeon. And what I mean by that is I come out of the technology ranks, I'm very interested in academia and what happens in academia, but I have an extremely skeptical perspective about a lot of things, and some of that will come across in this. One of the first things that I should probably cover is why someone who is 60 plus, and we're not going to have a discussion about that plus, why somebody 60 plus has gone back to school to get a doctorate. And there's a number of reasons for that, most of which were a function of the work that I was doing at Dell. At Dell, I was the Chief Innovation Officer. And part of the role that I had at Dell was actually doing foresight work. You know, Niels Bohr said that prediction was difficult, especially about the future, and he's absolutely correct. But what we would do is we would look at trends and we look at signals coming out of the marketplace, and we would create future scenarios, or what we would call science fiction stories about what the future would look like and where we at Dell would probably want to play. And a number of those were very, very interesting to me. One is the frictionless economy, the serendipity economy, the jobless economy. And I won't describe them to you, but they gave me this deep gut feeling that there's something wrong in business, the way business operates, the relationship with business with the rest of society. And I decided that I was the person in the world to go out and fix that. No ego here at all. The other thing that bothered me is I am a capitalist from the word go. You can't be a serial entrepreneur and not be a capitalist. But it bothered me of all the unintended consequences of capitalism, the fact that we have inequity in wealth distribution, the fact that we're polluting the planet, the fact that capitalism has actually put some of our social mores at risk. I mean, who truly believes the concept greed is good? So I wanted to understand that, because capitalism, if you think about it, was maybe one of the best inventions mankind has ever made. It has brought more wealth, more well-being, more health to more people than anything else we've invented, except maybe the scientific method. The other thing that bothered me was very few people were taking a systemic view of business, and in particular business's relationship with the rest of the world and society, and the fact that on a daily basis, almost every CIO I met and interacted with was basically clueless. And what I mean by clueless was they had this attitude that they could do anything because it was just business, not thinking about the impacts of things outside of business. The other thing that bothered me is how few CEOs would actually give luck the credit that was due. Because the fact of the matter is, most people, as you move up the organization, achieve that progression by luck as much as their particular skill sets, knowledge, and presentation. So that bothered me. The other thing that bothered me is when I would work with academics, there's this thing I call the academic bubble. What I mean by the academic bubble is a typical academician, and by the way, I am meant to be provocative rather than convince you, so don't worry about this is not an argument. I'm meant to basically joust at windmills. In fact, some people have described me as, compared to Don Quixote, I'm quite the irrational person. We're talking about academic. What I'm talking about is most academic work basically is successful because it assumes away all of the interesting parts of the problem. It is just the nature, economists I absolutely love, right? They have this thing, oh, don't worry about that. That's called an externality, right? So that's one piece of the academic bubble. The other piece of the academic bubble is the fact that if you are a practitioner, how do you get access to the corpora of any discipline? You can't. Unless you're a student at a university or you're willing to pay huge bucks, you cannot get to this huge knowledge base that we're all proud of. So it's unavailable to a practitioner. I would also argue that it's unaccessible by a practitioner. The fact that DBA programs' first class is how to read an academic paper. Mere humans can't do that. So we have that academic bubble. And then basically what I call the problem of rigor, or rigor mortis. And what we're talking about there is we work so hard to be rigorous on the academic work that it basically is inflexible, inadaptable, and you can't apply it to a real-world situation in most instances. So all of those things basically were bothering me, and I ran into Dr. Gill, and he said, I have the solution for you. Come be a DBA. He has regretted that for years. Everything looks like a nail. And then, actually, before I came back, I actually had an aha. And the aha came from a paper that was written by a guy by the name of Dave Snowden. And what he had done, he has developed something called the Kniffen framework. And what the Kniffen framework does is basically takes complexity and puts it into a form that mere mortals can address. There's been several articles in Harvard Business Review by Snowden, and other people have picked it up, and it is now becoming management practice. It would never appear in the Journal of the Santa Fe Institute, but it is something a normal person can read, understand, and begin to apply. And that became, if you will, my Northern Star. I wanted to be able to do something like the Kniffen framework. But then there's this problem. And the problem I talk about, how many people have ever seen The Invisible Gorilla? If you get a chance, query it, the Google, basically, and yeah, I can't tell you about, just go watch the movie. Just go watch the movie. And now I can't explain why I'm calling it The Invisible Gorilla, but we'll just go on. Gorilla. Yeah. And the issue is the nature of problems and who addresses those problems. If you look at the world of academia and PhDs, they basically address what I call there's actually a theory behind it, what's called tame problems. And their attitude about the real world problems, up there, research conducted for practitioners, is too messy and just not scientifically interesting. I have heard that when I've tried to get people to do research for me. On the other side of the coin, people like me are sitting on the other side of the table and saying, academics don't really do any relevant research that informs the needs of organizations. Those are not uncommon statements. And the issue is the problems that are dealt with in practice are basically messy, and the problems that are dealt with in the academic world are tame because you basically assume away all the messy parts. And the reality is the real world is not either one. The real world is wicked. What do I mean by wicked? Well, Horst and Melvin wrote a wonderful paper. In fact, Riddle is how he's referred to, Riddle Horst, called Dilemmas in the General Theory of Planning. And basically, he defined what a wicked problem is. The real world is nothing but wicked problems. Wicked problems are wicked for a number of reasons. First of all, you can't define them. Each one is unique. They're almost impossible to measure. Solutions are not true or false. They're only better or worse. Imagine trying to get your dissertation approved that this is better or worse as opposed to this is true or false. So basically, And this is available for you to read, and I've actually put a link to it where there's more description. This is what's interesting to DBAs. There are two types of there are two types of people, the people who say there are two types of people and the people who don't say there are two types of people. But there are basically two types of DBA, at least in the experience that we're having within the program. Those that want to bridge the academic practitioner gap, and it is a huge gap, and those who want to take on wicked problems. Problems that basically are not solvable, but we really want to try and make a dent in them. This is the business perspective of wicked problems. Basically, they generally have high components of non-business issues, social, moral, ethical issues. There are no right or wrong solutions. They are basically bet your job activities. So this is the perspective business has of wicked problems, and Riddle's paper talks about the academic perspective of wicked problems. Let me translate that into now I want to be an academician and I want to do research. A typical academic problem maybe has two issues in it, whereas a true real-world wicked problem has all of that spaghetti sitting there. But there's other issues. The key issue of a wicked problem is it, by definition, will be transdisciplinary and it will be interdisciplinary. And there's a problem with that, because the academic world's not really set up to deal with transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary problems. By the way, the dirty little secret is the practitioner world is not set up either. It's why organizations have finance, accounting, marketing, operations. So, why is this an issue? Well, I've spent years studying innovation. Interesting thing about innovation, it comes from the white space. When we say it comes from the white space, it means it comes from the gaps in the organization chart where people really aren't at. It comes from the gaps between disciplines where people really aren't studying. So academia, if you were to look at a university from the Middle Ages and compare it organizationally to a university today, you would not see very much difference. The other thing is, say you want to do.
Are you sure that he's going to graduate you?
Yeah. You have to remember, I'm a trustee. The other issue, and this one is one that I've learned about, particularly in my role of trustee, say you want to bring in someone who's going to do interdisciplinary work, or you want to do interdisciplinary work. Well, whose department is going to be in? Who's going to get publication credit? Who's going to be responsible for tenure? Who's going to publish it? Oh, by the way, if you're going to publish it, who's going to do a peer review on the article? What methods are you going to use? Who's going to fund it? What are the terminologies that are you going to bring in? If you start looking at the issue, and there's a great, in 2012, Lavoie wrote an article on neuroscience talking about neural economics, which is an example of a trans-discipline that doesn't have any place to publish, and the issues that are associated with it. There's some beautiful graphs, social networking graphs, where he shows all of the interdependencies that are necessary for neuroeconomics, which, by the way, he asserts is much better than traditional economics, second only to behavioral economics. So let me talk a little bit about my problem. I got into this, as I indicated, is why has capitalism caused so many unintended consequences? Again, if you look at capitalism, it's one of the greatest inventions of mankind. It has brought more wealth, more health, more well-being to more people. I mean, think about it. The royalty of 500 years ago were at a lower standard of living of people below the poverty line in the United States today. Capitalism did that. Now, capitalism is also polluting the planet. We have a huge, even though people in the poverty line are living better than the royalty of 500 years ago, there is this huge gap that's sitting there in terms of wealth. And like I said, everybody heard the term moral hazard? We seem to have a lot of that these days, again, a product of capitalism. So I started looking at it and said, look, I come from a systems background. if you start looking at society as basically a complex adaptive system made up of other systems, then what we are looking at is something called, out of general systems theory, which I think some of you may know, something called the suboptimization problem, which is the more you optimize a subsystem, the more you sub-optimize the overall system. Ah, brilliant. I can deal with that. Well, what causes over-optimization, particularly in the economic world? Well, it's this issue that's basically a market failure. We obviously are not accounting for all of the resources and who's using the resources in what way. We haven't achieved a Pareto optimality, basically between all of the resources of society. The reason that you would not achieve a Pareto optimality is the fact that you have an ineffective and inefficient information flow. So far, all the logic's going really well. I'm getting really excited about this thing. And basically, the inefficient and effective information flow is basically a Nash equilibrium failure. And basically, all of that, again, somebody brought up Shannon just recently. According to Shannon, that's probably a function of channel noise and the ontology and the semantics and everything. And Norbert Weiner gets in there as well. Wow, I've got this figured out, right? Wrong. Here's what I'm interested at. I'm interested in that little green dot right there, which is how do we change the model of business so that we don't have all of these unintended consequences? Well, how do I get there? Well, I get there obviously from the business world because I have to look at things like stakeholder theory and shareholder theory and basically what the governance models of a firm is. But I've also got to deal with this whole issue of complexity. And on top of complexity, I've got to deal with basically all of these economic issues. Nice thing is the economists know that they haven't figured everything out, so they actually have a theory of externalities. And the more I study the theory of externalities, it basically says, we all know what we're talking about, but you have to consider externalities when you're making a decision. I also have to deal with the fact that society is a system, so that's brought in all of the social systems theories that are associated with that. Now, one of the things that you'll notice here is I'm showing a whole lot of books. If you are going to do transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary work, you are not going to be reading papers. You're going to be reading books to get the holistic viewpoint of what's going on. Now, where I am at this point in time is I've gotten far enough along that I'm now delving into papers. Roth has come up with something called differential function systems, which basically takes society and lays it into basically 10 systems that you can actually do analysis on, one of which is the economy. I wanted, and I've been working on this, I wanted to use memes as a vehicle for dealing with the information problem of the systems talking to each other. Well, it turns out the academics don't like memes. In fact, all of memetics is considered a no-no. You should never reference that in the paper. But it's actually something a practitioner understands and appreciates. And the metaphor works. So now I'm having to go into another whole field that I wasn't prepared for, which is the canonical narrative schema, which basically comes from narrative theory. Basically, this is what DBAs want to work on. And the academic world is not set up to support them. And by the way, the last thing this piece is up here, you may or may not have heard of a methodology called ultraomics. It's only appeared in the last 3 years, and it's basically using the capabilities of the internet to be able to go in and see the usage of terms and the meanings of the terms across different areas of society. And that's basically the research method I'm using right now. Now, somebody like me and other DBAs, and in fact, that most work is transdisciplinary now, the really good stuff. And I don't, and by the way, I'm being provocative. I don't mean to demean the work that's going on in academia. But the fact is, we're not set up to deal with transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary work. Great quote up there by Thomas Kuhn, the father of the philosophy of science. And I was looking for it, and I couldn't find it to put in there. Karl Popper has also talked about the fact that we have an issue in science because we don't focus on being able to be interdisciplinary. There's been several discussions about it. We've talked about this before. Academic departments, they're basically organized around a certain individual disciplines. They do all the teaching, the recruiting, the advancement, promotion, degrees, course resource allocation, tenure grant credit, publication credit. Structurally, we're not set up to do it. We've talked about the publications, the funding issues. By the way, for the academics, the consultants are coming, okay? Unfortunately, while I complain about academic rigor, they are so far to the other side of the spectrum, it's ridiculous. Unfortunately, the rubber chicken circuit probably pays better than the academic world. And for some reason, we still have this Management Theory of the Month Club going on with senior executives, so they seem to be making progress. There is hope. Informing science, design science, the XXX economics, behavioral economics, neuroeconomics, socioeconomics. There's now a socio-neuroeconomics. And there's lots of papers, but not a whole lot of action. I want to call your attention to one other thing. How many people have read the Journal of Irreproducible Results? It probably would be the largest journal in academia, because the fact that most of you saw the APA and they came back and they said, oh, we tried to reproduce all of these assignments and all of these results and half of them failed miserably. I would argue that the reason the results are not reproducible is they are not in the same context as the original research, and the fact that they were not dealing with it as a messy problem, they were dealing with it as, if you will, a simple problem or a tame problem. Last, some thoughts from the beginner's mind. And I classify myself as a beginner in this process. First off, we need to be thinking differently. Yes, rigor is good, but maybe we should be inviting more people into the process. Maybe the practitioners have something to contribute. Maybe we should be thinking about different forms of contributions, not necessarily a paper, which I am in the midst of, and it'll probably take me 6 months to ever get if I'm lucky, to get it published. Maybe we should be dealing with the ability to, rather than prove true or false, maybe if we can just put a few, as Steve Jobs used to say, dents into the universe. Maybe that's a worthwhile academic activity. Modest advances. Maybe celebrate failures. We did this research and we were just really wrong. That's how we learn, guys. Maybe more grand prizes. Sometimes we forget that there's a journey destination process. We get overly focused on that. We've totally dismissed informed amateurs. Think about science from the 1200s up until maybe the 1800s. Most of the progress was made by informed amateurs, but we totally dismiss them in the academic community today. I've talked about judgment versus rigor, editors versus peers. I am always amazed that I am reminded, since I actually work with Harvard Business Review, that it's not an A journal. But every professor I've ever met would give his eye teeth to get published in Harvard Business Review, right? We have a cognitive dissonance in place there. Also understanding that maybe we need a hierarchy of blogs, articles, papers, which have different amounts of rigor to them, that are basically more speculative than perhaps the stuff that we're doing today. One of the things that'd be a great idea, and Paul's not going to like me for it, is that when you're doing research, you should write your academic paper and then immediately turn around and write a practitioner version of it. And if you can't do that, maybe you shouldn't be publishing the academic paper. How many people have heard of Goodhart's Law? Goodhart was the head of the Bank of England. I can never say the law exactly the way he said it because it's in lots of economic terms, but basically what Goodhart said is, as soon as you can have a wonderful measure on the health of the state of the system, but as soon as you turn that measure into a goal, it ceases to be a measure. What are the measures in the academic community? Papers, publications. Are we truly measuring what we intend? When we make a goal, when somebody at a research university has to produce 5 papers in 5 years, or somebody at a teaching university 2 papers in 5 years, have we mistaken a measure of value by turning it into a goal? Have we totally disrupted the value? And I would argue that a lot of the papers that I've had to wade through that contributed no value to what I was looking at are a product of this. How many people have ever read C.P. Snow's Two Cultures? Highly recommended. He was arguing that it's crazy there is such a difference between the humanities and the sciences in the academic community. That there is a conflict that takes place, they can't talk to each other, it's gone through multiple iterations. I would argue that the academic world needs to think in terms of, not that there are just 2 cultures, the culture of the humanities and the culture of science, but there is a third, as Wood has said, no, there is another one. There is the practitioners. We need to have the practitioners more engaged. I'll leave you with one thought, and hopefully it'll be loud enough for you to hear.
Imagine a vast plane, a world of only 2 dimensions, on which triangles, squares, pentagons, and other figures live and move freely about.
Configuration makes the man.
Thanks, brother.
They know nothing of our 3-dimensional world.
Such a notion is, of course, absurd and furthermore illegal.
But that's all about to change.
Where did you come from?
I come from space, the 3rd dimension.
No! No! You're not serious.
Based on the beloved novel by Edwin A. Allen.
Tonight our world faces a grave threat.
I can prove there is another dimension to space that is upward.
It's so hard to imagine, but wouldn't that be amazing?
My own infinite universe of 0 dimensions.
Wonderful. We're going to be truncated. No,
Not that angle.
I came to reveal the truth of the 3rd dimension. No more.
Dude, you're freaking me out!
What exactly is a dimension?
mathematics, reason, and imagination will help reveal the truth.
Flatland, the movie.
The 3rd dimension is real.
With you because the conversations that I have both with the practitioners and with the academics is not unlike the circle in Flatland trying to convince people that 3rd dimension exists. And before we get overly confident and cocky that we can figure it out, there is actually a Flatland Squared movie in where the spear discovers the 4th dimension. Both of these are available on YouTube. I would highly encourage. They're enjoyable for no other reason than they're just enjoyable. With that, thank you very, very much, and I enjoyed talking to you.